And what we need is leaders in this country who are honest in calling out atrocities where they occur. What happened in Israel was wrong. It is barbaric, it is medieval, It is wrong, and Israel as a nation absolutely has the right to self-defense, to its own national existence.
Tucker Carlson's voice pierces the air with urgency, dissecting the aftermath of the Hamas attacks with a fervent tone that seeks wisdom amidst chaos, painting a narrative of thoughtful consideration in tumultuous times.
If you serve in the U.S. Congress or in the executive branch of government, you have a moral duty to think this way. It's your job. You serve the United States and its population. You have no moral authority except to the extent that you represent your fellow Americans. That's our system. It used to be obvious, but it's worth remembering now, because the conflict between Israel and Hamas could escalate into a war between and its allies and the West.
But one of the learnings is, if that establishment can get it wrong in Israel from a U.S. perspective, that could happen right here at home. And if anything, as an ally, one of the things that we need to wake up to is that we're vulnerable here in the United States to the same. And so we can do some things to prevent that, secure our border, stop funding.
No decent person can watch the video of young people being at a music festival in southern Israel without feeling horrified. It's awful, and there's no excusing it. No matter what you think of Israel's policies in Gaza, you are not allowed to people at music festivals. Israel has a right to respond to that and to defend itself. No one seriously contests that.
I mean, I think one of the things that's been wrong in the U.S. is we have a bad habit, while we're bankrupt, funding both sides of wars that should have been avoided in the first place. Look at the money that's indirectly found its way to Hamas, the $6 billion paid to in the recent ransom. That was a disaster.
In Carlson's words, a question hangs heavy in the air. After the ferocious onslaught by Hamas, what path should America tread?
The question for American policymakers, however, is what do we do next? How do we represent the interests of the United States in this chaotic moment? That's not a selfish question. It's the whole point of making policy for a country, to improve and protect that country. These are not complex observations, but they seem lost on our leadership class. Alone among candidates running for the Republican nomination for president, Vivek Ramaswamy dared to suggest that actually going to war with might not be in America's national interest. And for saying that, Mike Pence immediately denounced him as gutless and unpatriotic or something. What exactly would happen to the United States if we declared war on Iran and started their infrastructure? Lindsey Graham has no clue what would happen. He hasn't thought it through. He's almost 70 years old and he has no children. He doesn't care. But neither, amazingly, do most of his colleagues in Washington. They're as reckless as he is. Once a war like that starts, you could easily imagine the use of weapons and all that entails. Millions, the collapse of the global economy. At the very least, you could see an unprecedented energy crisis here. Already gas in one Bay Area service station hit $7.29 a gallon over the weekend. If that trend worsens and persists, the United States, which is already, technically speaking, bankrupt, would plunge into depression. And no, it would not be like the 1930s. Close to 10 million people have come here over the last 3 years from the poorest places in the world. The overwhelming majority of them are on some form of federal subsidies. You wonder how that's going to work out when the U.S. government runs out of money. So there's a lot at stake in how we encourage Israel to respond to the horrifying Hamas attack. Wisdom and long-term thinking are essential, but you will not be surprised to learn that is not what we are getting.
Each syllable resonates with the weight of the situation, urging the nation towards a prudent and strategic response.
Yet we're effectively now funding both sides of a war that we shouldn't have been in the first place in places like Russia and even. Think about how we hampered oil production in the United States and then now has funding, U.S. funding going to in fighting back against Russia. It's a bad habit in the United States, and we need leaders here who will look after what advances American interests. And I find what Dan Crenshaw said to be cringeworthy. It is shameful. World War I was supposed to be the war that ended all wars, that got us to World War II. That can't be the way that we run foreign policy. The job of American leaders is to advance American interests, and I think we support Israeli leaders asking what advances and defends Israel as we should, morally and diplomatically, but leaders here need to look after American interests first. I'm not in the world of politics, or I'm in the world of politics now, but for like all of 7 months. Before that, I'm looking at it from the outside in. You wonder why, right? It's a bit of a mystery when you see the Lindsey Grahams or the Nikki Haley's or the John Boltons or the, other people of this persuasion, the Mike Pence's, the Chris Christie wing of this party. Being now in the sport, I think I do have a much better understanding for why it's played the way that it is. It comes down, in most cases, some people do have ideological commitments that are outdated, that are earnest, but a lot of it comes down to money. The corrupting influence of super PACs on the process. And I think that in the same frame of putting American interests first in our foreign policy, even when you think about a left-wing idea from 15, 20 years ago, I'd embrace it now to say, get the influence of super PACs and mega money out of politics. I would be happy to tell any super PAC backing me to give money back to those mega donors and that I want to show up at your events or whatever, as long as Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis and Tim Scott and everybody else parading in a political race as standing for their own views does the same thing. And that's not a panacea, it's not a fix-all, but when you understand that there are interests at work that go beyond just the earnest debate of differing views, that's really, I think, how we're going to get back to honest discourse in the Republican Party and in American politics, is get the influence of mega money out of politics. The super PACs are a cancer. I'm happy to lead the way, but without that, I think we're going to probably just be destined to expect more of the same. That's just the hard fact.
How soulless would you have to be to take cash in exchange for wrecking your own country? And by the way, the ones who are emotionally committed to it, the true warmongers, I know all of them, and I can say this about them: not one of them has a normal life. I'm just saying that. That's true. Whatever.
With a blend of intensity and introspection, Carlson delves into the post-Hamas attack landscape, his voice carrying a sense of responsibility, exploring the intricate web of decisions that lie ahead and the consequences they might bear.
So if I'm reading this correctly, you suggested, while offering what seemed like real sympathy to the Israeli people, and to the many there 2 days ago, you noted that maybe it's not in America's best long-term interest to declare war on. Is that what you said?
I actually said this long before this crisis, when people were thinking clear-headedly. And I just want to say a couple of things that are obvious but important, Tucker. I mean, what happened against Israel, you said it, I believe it. It is barbaric, it is medieval, it is wrong, and Israel as a nation absolutely has the right to self-defense, to its own national existence. And I think they should have our moral and diplomatic support as an ally. But there's one element of this that nobody's talking about. What the went wrong with U.S. and Israeli intelligence and the Israeli defense that allowed this to happen? Everybody seems to be punting that as a question for later. I think it's a question for now, if you're Israel. I mean, look, I think that Nikki Haley, I disagree with you a little bit there. I don't think she's a child. I think that she is somebody who is, like many politicians, in a position to get wealthier from war. Look at the military contracting business and otherwise. But put that to one side. The message that I would send would be very different. Get to the bottom of what allowed this gaping hole of intelligence and defense to even happen before feeding that same beast. If a doctor told you his job was to keep you from getting cancer and then you got that cancer, don't go trust that same doctor to remove your tumor. They don't let airplanes, when they crash, the pilots or the people who crash the airplane, that airliner is not the one who reviews the black box. And so I think those answers have to come now. That's not a question for later.
Through Carlson's narrative lens, the aftermath of the Hamas attacks becomes a canvas of deliberation, each word etched with the gravity of the situation, urging viewers to contemplate the choices that will shape the nation's future.
The conversation can't be limited to right and wrong. I mean, I don't think there's anyone defending the murder of concert goers in the Negev 2 days ago is, disqualified from, being taken seriously. Yeah. Of course, that's wrong. But it doesn't seem like any American policymaker is even willing to entertain other questions like what's in America's best interest, what effect will this have on the global economy, on our economy, on energy prices. These are not small things. They should not be dismissed, but they are dismissed out of hand, and you're some sort of quizzling if you even raise the question. Why is that? It seems crazy to me.
Well, look, I mean, if you want to ask the question of right and wrong, then open that Pandora's box. I don't favor doing this, but look at what's happening with Azerbaijan and Armenia. You don't really hear much about that now. Why? Because Azerbaijan's lobby is about as effective as is in Washington, D.C. So this selective moral outrage, I do think is a problem.
May I ask you to pause for just one moment there and just unpack that for viewers who are not aware of what you're referring to? Armenia, Azerbaijan, what is happening?
Yeah, so, I mean, what's happening is an atrocity. I mean, you have a people who are Armenians, largely Christians, six-figure numbers, 120,000, being driven back to their country from a region that has long been a place they have called home. A lot of atrocities that aren't even yet coming to light in Western media. But Azerbaijan has a lobby, a powerful lobby in Washington, D.C.
Texas Congressman Dan Crenshaw took to social media to call for what he described as a war to end all wars, as if there is such a thing. But of course, there isn't such a thing. Wars beget more war. The bigger the conflict, the uglier and longer lasting the consequences. See World War I for details.
Carlson's voice resonates with a profound sense of concern, urging America to navigate the turbulent aftermath of the Hamas attacks with wisdom.
But in a limited way that advances U.S. interests, that has to be the sole prism. And that doesn't exist right now, Tucker, in the establishment of either political party. And I think that the things that we're saying now, to some may sound uncouth. I don't think they should. This is what the job of a national leader actually ought to be. And that's how I'm planning to lead this country if I'm elected.
I got to say, you mentioned moral outrage, and I thought the videos from southern Israel were morally outrageous, and I was offended by them and saddened by them. Anyone who saw them, I think, was. But you don't have to look far in the United States for moral outrages also on video. And there's not a city in this country, not just the big cities, but cities of 10,000 people, I was in one yesterday, that doesn't have some constellation of addicted young people living outside. We call them the homeless, they're addicts. And they're addicted to that were imported across an open border, allowed by the Biden administration. And they're more than 100,000 a year. Now, you can call it whatever you want, but it's the of over 100,000 Americans a year and the living of millions more who are living outside. So sure. I don't understand. People are outraged by what happened in Israel. And again, I want to add my voice to that because I'm a human being. But the scale of the outrage among Republican presidential candidates was so much more intense. One of them took to a bullhorn and started yelling about it. I get it. But no one would think to do that about the 100,000 American young people every year, and they are, honestly, by
give me a bullhorn for that one.
Like Chuck, what?
I'll take my bullhorn for that one. And let's just go a little bit deeper on that one. This is the product of some intentional design. I mean, there are literally synthetic precursors to make synthetic fentanyl coming from Wuhan, of all places, to Mexican cartels south of our own border, pumping that up, and you want to just numbers to get the scale intact.
His words weave a tale of strategic thinking and prudence, a narrative essential for a nation at a crossroads.
And I think a big part of what's wrong in the United States today, Tucker, and I don't mean to toot my own horn, but it's why I'm coming in as an outsider to this nonsense, is you have a system that is bought and paid for, both for the people who run on the Democratic ticket, people who run on the Republican ticket, and people who make those decisions in Washington, D.C. that are effectively managed by, in this case, the Azerbaijan lobby that has a lid on discussing this conflict, which, as you pointed out, most Americans haven't heard of. But you'll hear endlessly about Russia's incursion on Ukraine and having to stand on the right side. That's a separate point where I reject that is inherently good anyway. But even if it were, a selective moral outrage in that case, but not another one in just a neighboring area that interfaces with Russia as well. So open that Pandora's box around the world. I mean, look at much of Africa, look elsewhere. You're going to find ability to have selective moral outrage. But you only hear about it in certain selective cases that the media and the existing establishment in both parties deem fit for the American public. And what we need is leaders in this country who are honest in calling out atrocities where they occur. What happened in Israel was wrong. I think we require leaders, some on the far left are too afraid to say it. It was wrong. But at the same time, we need leaders on the right who are willing to say it in other places too, like what's happening in Azerbaijan and Armenia. But at the same time, to have the clarity and American-centric forethought to say what policy decisions we make are separate from the moral judgments that we will pass. So to say we will be with you diplomatically, absolutely. To say you have our moral support, absolutely. That we're not going to get in the way of you defending your national boundaries, absolutely. Even further, to say that in limited circumstances that advance U.S. interests, we will provide munitions. We can't do it across the board. It's a zero-sum game when it comes to munitions between Israel.
What exactly would happen to the United States if we declared war on Iran and started their infrastructure? Lindsey Graham has no clue what would happen. He hasn't thought it through. He's almost 70 years old and he has no children. He doesn't care. But neither, amazingly, do most of his colleagues in Washington. They're as reckless as he is.
That's why it's so important that we have to wake up, understand what we've done has backfired. Whatever we set out to achieve has failed. What we need to do now is stop this and come to a settlement that we may not like, but it needs to happen, and soon, before this thing is out of control.
I think I do have a much better understanding for why it's played the way that it is. It comes down, in most cases, some people do have ideological commitments that are outdated, that are earnest, but a lot of it comes down to money. The corrupting influence of super PACs on the process.
Now, that $14 trillion is largely debt financed. So then you have to move from the $14 trillion to where we stand now in national sovereign debt, which, of course, I know the economic luminaries think is meaningless.
With every word, Carlson paints a damning portrait of colossal waste, where billions vanish into the void, leaving a trail of financial ruin that mocks the hopes of a nation.
Texas Congressman Dan Crenshaw took to social media to call for what he described as a war to end all wars, as if there is such a thing. But of course, there isn't such a thing. Wars beget more war. The bigger the conflict, the uglier and longer lasting the consequences. See World War I for details.
At what cost do you think to the United States?
The latest estimates since 2001, spending, including the spending, all the military spending designed to support these interventions, conflicts, wars, whatever you want to call them, about $14 trillion.
But one of the learnings is, if that establishment can get it wrong in Israel from a U.S. perspective, that can happen right here at home. And if anything, as an ally, one of the things that we need to wake up to is that we're vulnerable here in the United States to the same. And so we can do some things to prevent that, secure our border, stop funding. I mean, I think one of the things that's been wrong in the U.S. is we have a bad habit while we're bankrupt, funding both sides of wars that should have been avoided in the first place. Look at the money that's indirectly found its way to Hamas, the $6 billion paid to in the recent ransom. That was a disaster. Yet we're effectively now funding both sides of a war that we shouldn't have been in the first place in places like Russia and even. Think about how we hampered oil production in the United States and then now has funding, U.S. funding going to in fighting back against Russia. It's a bad habit in the United States, and we need leaders here who will look after what advances American interests. And I find what Dan Crenshaw said to be cringeworthy. It is shameful. World War I was supposed to be the war that ended all wars, that got us to World War II. That can't be the way that we run foreign policy. The job of American leaders is to advance American interests. And I think we support Israeli leaders asking what advances and defends Israel as we should, morally and diplomatically. But leaders here need to look after American interests first.
Carlson's tone quivers with disbelief, unraveling a tale of unchecked profligacy where billions disappear into the abyss. A stark reminder of bureaucratic decadence that taints the very soul of America.
What about the space-age military technology that we've been sending to Ukraine? That hasn't brought parity?
Well, first of all, a lot of the equipment we send over there is, quite frankly, obsolete. It's very old. It's not new. We've given them a few new items, but not much. And remember what I said about we sent them some Patriots. And I think at this point in this newest round of money, what, 750 million, something like that, we're sending 33, Patriot. These are that are used to shoot down aircraft or cruise incoming opposing forces. Every time you're in air defense, people will tell you if there's a target out there, you shoot at it as a minimum to make sure you get the target. Well, you run out of armor in the space of a few days. 33 will be gone in 2 or 3 days. You can't possibly defeat the thousands of that are being hurled in your direction. And the radars, of course, emit, and so your radars light up and become targets. This is a no-win situation because the Russians, though they were not prepared in February 2022 for this kind of war, they are now. And they're continuing to prepare, which includes continuous mobilization. They're up to 750,000 troops in and around. Most of them are on the outskirts, Belarus, Western Russia, down in southern. That number is going to rise over the next year, I would expect, to 1.2 million.
No decent person can watch the video of young people being at a music festival in southern Israel without feeling horrified. It's awful, and there's no excusing it. No matter what you think of Israel's policies in Gaza, you are not allowed to shoot people at music festivals. Israel has a right to respond to that and to defend itself. No one seriously contests that. The question for American policymakers, however, is what do we do next? How do we represent the interests of the United States in this chaotic moment? That's not a selfish question. It's the whole point of making policy for a country, to improve and protect that country.
With Carlson's revelation, there's a somber melody, a dirge for the billions that vanish into oblivion.
But it was the West's reaction to the Russian invasion that seemed ominous. Policymakers in the U.S. went insane. Joe Biden, helped by his Republican allies in the Senate, appeared to be determined not simply to topple the Russian government in some kind of regime change war, but to blow up the post-war economic order that had served the U.S. so generously for so long. So we thought at the time that the real threat to our future wasn't just the billions we were sending to Zelensky. That was reckless, but probably not going to end America. The real threat was the unprecedented economic sanctions that Joe Biden was allowed to, in fact, encouraged to impose. Those sanctions, you'll recall, were supposed to hurt Russia. But even in March of last year, it seemed obvious they were going to hurt the United States much more than they hurt Russia. These are not complex observations, but they seem lost on our leadership class. Alone among candidates running for the Republican nomination for president, Vivek Ramaswamy dared to suggest that actually going to war with might not be in America's national interest. And for saying that, Mike Pence immediately denounced him as gutless and unpatriotic or something. But we thought it might be worth hearing more. Future generations will look at that tape and many tapes like it with their jaws open. As long as it takes, whatever the cost for you. As the American economy heads toward total destruction, in large numbers, who's winning? Well, oligarchs. They're getting richer, much richer. Since January of this year, the Biden administration has sent about $8 billion just in so-called security assistance alone to you. That would include systems, howitzers, ammunition, radar systems, et cetera, et cetera. Now, defense contractors are making a ton from this, and that's why they have lobbied for it so hard. But you have to ask, once we send these weapons to you, where do they go then? What happens to them? These are sophisticated and deadly weapon systems. Well, no one knows where they go. No one's keeping track. U.S. officials, Biden administration officials, have admitted that to the Wall Street Journal, and we're quoting. Once U.S. equipment, materiel, is handed to the government, U.S. officials said they have little direct knowledge of where that materiel goes. They rely instead on the government for such information. The administration has not agreed to allow American military troops to conduct some oversight into that country, end quote. So you send billions to in the middle of a war and then you don't bother to find out what happens to it, what will happen to these weapons? Well, the Czech defense minister knows. He has said these weapons, some of them, will be smuggled out of. Quote, it's hard to avoid trafficking or smuggling. We didn't achieve it in the former Yugoslavia, and we probably won't avoid it in. This is lunacy. If you wanted to make Eastern Europe dangerous and unstable for generations, ensure that war continues and many more, this is exactly what you would do. You would treat you like we treated.
A mournful tale of resources lost, leaving the nation impoverished in spirit and substance.
So if I'm reading this correctly, you suggested, while offering what seemed like real sympathy to the Israeli people, the many there 2 days ago, you noted that maybe it's not in America's best long-term interest to declare war. Is that what you said?
I actually said this long before this crisis when people were thinking clear-headedly. And I just want to say a couple of things that are obvious but important, Tucker. I mean, what happened against Israel, you said it, I believe it. It is barbaric, it is medieval, It is wrong. And Israel as a nation absolutely has the right to self-defense, to its own national existence. And I think they should have our moral and diplomatic support as an ally. But there's one element of this that nobody's talking about. What the went wrong with U.S. and Israeli intelligence and the Israeli defense that allowed this to happen? Everybody seems to be punting that as a question for later. I think it's a question for now, if you're Israel. I mean, look, I think that Nikki Haley, I disagree with you a little bit there. I don't think she's a child. I think that she is somebody who is, like many politicians, in a position to get wealthier from war. Look at the military contracting business and otherwise. But put that to one side. The message that I would send would be very different. Get to the bottom of what allowed this gaping hole of intelligence and defense to even happen before feeding that same beast. If a doctor told you his job was to keep you from getting cancer and then you got that cancer, don't go trust that same doctor to remove your tumor. They don't let airplanes, when they crash, the pilots or the people who crash the airplane, that airliner is not the one who reviews the black box. And so I think those answers have to come now. That's not a question for later.
With each sentence, Carlson unveils a tragedy, a chronicle of senseless expenditure, where billions vanish without a trace.
We should prepare to lose our position as holder of the world's reserve currency. That is happening in slow motion. It's unmistakable. Now, the Biden people seem to have no idea this is going on, or maybe they want it to happen. Joe Biden was up there at the State of the Union bragging about how he took 30 points off the Russian ruble in a single day. Hooray, good for us. But once we stop celebrating our win, the destruction of the Russian economy, they deserve it. You got to wonder, is there a downside to this? Could it be a Pyrrhic victory? Let's see. These policies have driven Russia, China, India, Turkey, and other countries to accelerate their flight from the US dollar. Now, to be clear, that's the majority of the global economy. This may be the most reckless and destructive thing any American president has ever done to the United States. So your tax dollars are now paying the salaries of government bureaucrats. In all, your Congress has approved more than $50 billion. That includes $7 billion in food assistance and healthcare, along with $9 billion for economic support, whatever that means. There's also $2 billion for refugee assistance. So just as we did in I don't know, half a dozen other countries, we're sending bales of $100 bills into a war zone and hoping they find the right pockets. Again, this is nuts. And yet, leaders of both parties agree we have to keep doing it. Much more of it. Dozens of Democrats in Congress just signed a letter pushing the administration, as if they needed to be pushed, to award the International Monetary Fund a total of $650 billion in new funding because, and on top of all of that, Congressman Adam Kinzinger just proposed an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act calling for another $100 million for, quote, military pilots and associated personnel. Kinzinger's the guy who thought the ghost of Kiev was real. Now, all of this is necessary. It's mandatory. We must, according to members of both parties, because we must defend democracy.
A narrative that resonates with the anguished cries of taxpayers burdened by the weight of wastefulness.
So that was last year, and at the time, it was really just yelling into the wind. Those views were considered absurd, even treasonous. Biden and his Republican allies described sanctions against Russia as morally essential. So we seized oligarchs' yachts at anchor. We closed the Apple store in Moscow. We were all assured these were important victories, and anyone who asked questions about their long-term economic consequences was a Putin stooge. So as long as you're afraid of that, you're not going to be very effective fighting against people who really are serving a cause they believe is larger than themselves. Now, I think it's Satan or whatever you call it, but it doesn't matter what I think. They believe they are acting on behalf of something larger than themselves, the revolution. And it seems to me maybe the one takeaway is, like, that's table stakes in Christian faith. Fearlessness. That is actually the marker of it. Are you afraid or are you not? Well, if you're afraid, then you're kind of not doing it right, are you? Like, there's no excuse for being afraid. And if you're just like, make it go away, I don't want to be uncomfortable, you're going to lose. And the consequences are going to be horrible. Probably not for anyone in this room, because like everyone here is kind of higher income and older like me. But certainly for your kids, there's like no chance they'll prosper in a country like that. There's no chance. And your grandkids, I mean, they'll just be like texting each other, where can we move? Where can we move? Oh, nowhere. So this is not a political debate. This is a spiritual battle. There is no other conclusion. Take more and be happy? Right, okay. Less conscious, less aware. Give your soul over. Dull yourself. Become a robot. Really? Those are the promises they're making?
Leaving the audience hanging on his every word. In the air hangs an air of bewilderment as Carlson dissects the notion of courage turning into a moral dilemma.
So it's essential not to be afraid to. And once you decide, I'm really not afraid to, nothing scares you. Like, what's scary at that point? Bring it on. Oh, you're going to criticize me on Facebook. You're going to bring suit against me. You're going to arrest me. You're going to kill me. So what? Go ahead. And I would make two arguments, and I'll stop with this because now I'm really getting crazy, but I mean it. The one unalloyed source of joy in your life is your children. The point of life is to have children and to watch them have grandchildren. Nothing will bring you joy like that will. Nothing comes close. Nothing comes close. Would you trade your job for your children? Would you trade anything for your children? Of course not. The person who's brave wins. Period. And in a moment like this, the stakes are higher. It's not just a matter of like being the next guy who invents something cool and then figures out a way to sell it. No, it's, do you want your children to be able to live here? Do you want to have grandchildren at all? And if you're not brave, that won't happen. And it's very clear at this point. And I could bore you with a lot of dark stats, but I'm not going to because you know them. And so be brave. And by the way, there's nothing easier. The key to being brave is brooding about. This is just true, I believe. The key to being brave is brooding about. All anxiety and all fear stems from the most basic of all fears, which is the fear of death, which is inborn. You feel it from the moment you arrive, because you know it's going to end on some level. My deepest child on her 5th birthday burst into tears, and I said, why? All my other more shallow children were psyched for the cake. My deep child said, well, I don't want it to end. And I said, what? My life. I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. I could drown in these waters. They're too deep. I did start crying. Yes, I did. Okay, I'll admit it. But anyway, but whether we articulate it or not, that is the root of all anxiety. And so you need to focus on that. And I grew up in a place when I was a kid called La Jolla, California, which had a lot of, I know someone just snickered. Okay, got it. Yes, I know. It has a lot going for it. It's beautiful and all that. But in retrospect, the one thing that made it a really bad place actually to grow up and to live, and why I don't visit anymore, is there was only one taboo in La Jolla and in all kind of affluent towns like La Jolla in the West, which is, it's like the one thing you could not talk about. I mean, people had freaky situations in La Jolla that would, but even in Wilmington, you'd be shocked.
His words laced with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. challenging conventional wisdom.
So how do you respond to this? And that's what I've been thinking about all day. I went on my morning walk with my dogs in Maine this morning, from which I derive much wisdom every morning, my wife and I. And by the way, I'm not a theologian, I'm the opposite of a theologian, so don't take any theological insight from me at all. I'm just a reader, okay? And here's what's jumped out at me. So my second favorite character in the New Testament is Paul. And I think, from what I can tell, the bulk of the New Testament is written by or about Paul. He's a leading character in this drama, I would say. And I think just an amazing person, because he was not a good person. He was like a horrible person. He was on his way to Christians when he was knocked down and blinded, and then pivoted on a dime and devoted his life to spreading the gospel. So I find it very inspiring that a truly awful person could become one of the great people of all time. That's reassuring. But the two qualities that really jump out of the story of Paul's life, first and most obviously, is the courage. This is like the bravest guy ever. There's not a letter he wrote where he didn't have hanging over his neck. He expected at any moment he, and I think the consensus among historians is, in the end he was. He was, as were all of his friends. But he lived with the certainty that he was going to be for his beliefs every day. And he was totally unbothered by it, completely. He was just moving as fast as he could in the time allotted. He didn't know how much he had, but he just kept going, but he was never afraid. As his boat was sinking in the Med, in his year-long journey, and everyone with us freaking out, totally fine. Oh, we're shipwrecked, no problem. Never afraid. And by the way, why would he be afraid? He believed his fate was sealed. He was going to join Jesus. He was going to heaven. He was totally convinced of that.
The room falls into an uneasy silence, echoing Carlson's inner turmoil as he grapples with the concept of bravery.
Nothing was judged. Like, well, I ended up, marrying the babysitter, but then I brought the massage therapist in for some polygamy, and people were like, that's cool, really? Yeah, no problem. No judgment whatsoever, none. The one thing you couldn't do was talk about or any of its attendant symptoms like aging. No aging. And if you got old enough and your age was visible enough, you had to go to Palm Springs. You had to, no, I'm serious. It was our equivalent of putting you on the ice floe. Okay, like the Inuit do. Sorry, and it's like, whatever happened to Mrs. So-and-so? I don't know. She was in our 450 SLC just driving east. Never saw her again. And she's in Palm Desert at Thunderbird or whatever. And now she's, you don't know. But the one thing you could never say about Mrs. So-and-so is she, like we all will. Totally not acceptable. And as a result of that, beneath, and if those of you who've lived there or know the area or any town like that, I doubt Aspen or Jackson are any different, right? The one thing about those towns is the anxiety level is crazy high. And that's why everyone's on benzos. Or like climbing to the top of Snow King manically or whatever, doing so much cardio that they calm down. I'm not joking. Anyone familiar with the culture I'm talking about? The white wine, now Casamigos, it's changed, but whatever, same idea. There's a crazy amount of anxiety because no one can acknowledge the core truth of life, which is that it ends. And any attempt to even talk about this or engage in a religious discussion, which by definition implies powerlessness, was rejected as repulsive and it made everyone crazy, and it made them cowards. That's true, it made them cowards.
Once a beacon of hope, now cast in a shadow of doubt, leaving viewers introspective and contemplative.
I grew up in it. My ancestors were in it. High-level people in it. I married into it. I was educated in it. I educated my kids in it. I was as firmly ensconced as that church as you could be, even as it crumbled around us and became this very aggressively pagan institution. But we stayed because it's hard to leave something you grew up in. But the moment that we left for good, and actually really, it was the greatest thing we ever did, really got to understand God better once we left church. Weird how that works. But the moment that catalyzed it for us was which was really an amazing and clarifying experience. And I'm just, as sad as it was, I'm so grateful that we lived through that because everything became so much clearer than it was. But the church that we went to closed and they closed their Christmas service. And we have this, the one thing about the Episcopal Church, we have this amazing liturgy written by actual Christians. And we have lessons and carols, this like ritual that I grew up with. My wife grew up with, her father's an Episcopal minister, and we love it. And all of our children come home and we go to it, and it's just this beautiful service, and they canceled lessons and carols. And I know I'm revealing how shallow I am, but I just wanted to go to the service because I love lessons and carols. I love all the carols, and I love all the lessons. And they didn't have it. And I said to my wife, well, why aren't we having lessons and carols? Like, that's like a requirement. There's no Episcopal church without lessons and carols. Like, what? And she's like, well, and the minister sent this letter, here it is. She is afraid that she's going to, and I was like, well, she's afraid she's gonna. Why is she worried about? She's a Christian minister. Like, why should she care?
Carlson's voice cuts through the silence, laden with a sense of urgency as he delves deeper into the implications of this question, the air thick with the weight of a society questioning its core values.
I would make two arguments on behalf of not being afraid of. And the first is just an obvious mechanistic argument that I think everyone, regardless of religious faith, can understand, which is you're gonna anyway, and it's gonna be horrible. So like, why not? You're playing with the house money. And I would recommend, one of the greatest essays I've ever read was by George Orwell, written in, as part of a book he wrote called Down and Out in Paris and London, but he winds up in a hospital in Paris in the 30s during the Depression with tuberculosis. George Orwell was a man of famous and proven physical courage. In the throat by a sniper standing guard during the Spanish Civil War on the wrong side, unfortunately, but whatever, he was trying. And didn't mention it in his diary. Didn't mention it in his diary. I mean, this is a man who had, went to Eton, in 1913, grew up rough in the way that the British upper classes used to raise their boys, in a martial way, actually. And he winds up in this hospital for the indigent, and he's in a huge bay, like the size of this room, filled with metal cots, and people all around him are, but they're not of anything interesting. They haven't been in the throat by a sniper, but they ain't milling your mouths around. They're of like diarrhea and the flu. And he describes in this wonderful essay how horrible it is. And he has this line there, he says, there's so many tears shed for guys who, during the Great War, which is only 10 years before. And he goes, that's very sad. Obviously, he grew up in a world where all the men were that way. But he goes, that's kind of nothing compared to the way the people around me are. Like, it's gonna be bad no matter what. You might as well go with your shoes on doing something you believe in. That was Orwell's conclusion.
In the midst of uncertainty, Carlson's voice grows stronger, his conviction unwavering as he navigates the intricacies of this moral quandary, a beacon guiding viewers through the murky waters of societal change.
God singled that out. Now, why were people doing that? Because, of course, they believed they were getting power and contentment and happiness in return. All it's going to take is your children. This is as old as time. Every civilization on the face of the earth has engaged in it. Every one, not just the Mayans and the Aztecs, but the Scandinavians, my people. No, it's true. Even the Swedes did it. I know, it's embarrassing. But the archaeological record tells us that humans of children, the of children, is the one constant in human civilization. Now, you answer the question, how can that be? How did all these civilizations at different points of the compass that we know had no contact with one another reach the same conclusion that in exchange for their own children, they would be happy or safe? Probably not a conclusion they reached organically, right? It cuts against the imperative of evolutionary biology, which is to continue the species. And those of us who grew up in a secular world being taught that people are motivated by instinct designed to continue the species, pause at that and say, wait a second, how does their own children advance the cause of perpetuating the species? It doesn't. In fact, it's an on that. So it's not a natural human function to want to kill your own children, actually. That's an idea, an impulse that was introduced Outside forces are acting on people at all times throughout history in every culture on the planet to convince people that if they their children, they will be happy and safe. And that's exactly what this is. This is a religious right. This is not a policy debate. They're not telling you that some girl got at 13 and she needs to go to college and therefore, unfortunately, we need to have a child. No, that was 20 years ago. Now they're saying, is itself a pathway to joy? Really?